I left the restaurant that afternoon with the same calm smile I had worn at the table, though the sunlight outside felt strangely brighter than before. The air coming off the lake carried the soft warmth of early summer, and families walked along the sidewalk with bouquets of flowers and brightly wrapped gifts in their hands. Mother's Day has always been one of those holidays that fills the streets with a certain kind of happiness, the kind that feels easy and natural for everyone else. I walked slowly toward my car parked 2 blocks away, the small plastic bracelet still resting in my purse inside its thin silver box. I did not feel angry. Not exactly. What I felt was quieter than that, something closer to understanding. When a person lives long enough, certain moments arrive that quietly rearrange the way you see the world. That morning had been one of them. As I reached my car, I paused for a moment and looked out across the water. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the afternoon sun like a sheet of pale glass. I thought about Emily as a little girl, standing on the same shoreline years ago with sand clinging to her shoes while she held my hand, and asked if the lake ever ended. I remembered packing her school lunches every morning before my hospital shifts, helping with science projects late at night, and sitting through every school recital, even when the chairs were uncomfortable and the auditorium was too warm. Like most mothers, I never kept track of those moments because they simply felt like part of loving your child. Inside the restaurant earlier, when Emily slid that small box across the table, I had noticed something more than the price tag. I had noticed how quickly the moment passed, how naturally the conversation returned to the cruise and the diamond ring, as if the difference between the gifts had been invisible to everyone except me. That realization stayed with me during the drive home. My apartment was quiet when I stepped inside, just the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I placed my purse on the table and took the bracelet from its box, turning it gently between my fingers. The pink plastic heart caught the light from the window and reflected it in a small, dull glow. I set it beside the framed photograph of Robert that sat near the window. My late husband had always believed that respect in a family revealed itself through small gestures rather than big speeches. Standing there in the quiet living room, I realized he had been right. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Emily thanking everyone for coming to brunch. She added a cheerful smiley face and wrote that she hoped everyone had enjoyed the day. I read the message once and placed the phone back on the table without replying immediately. Outside, the sun was beginning to sink behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the parking lot. For the first time in a long while, I began thinking carefully about certain decisions I had postponed for years. Not dramatic decisions, and certainly not angry ones. Just quiet changes. The kind that happen when a person finally understands their place in a room that once felt like home. I slept lightly that night, the quiet hum of the refrigerator drifting through the apartment like a steady reminder that life moves forward whether we notice it or not. The small bracelet still rested beside Robert's photograph on the table near the window, and when the morning light filtered through the curtains, it landed directly on the plastic heart charm. It was strange how such a small object could reveal so much about a moment that otherwise would have passed like any other holiday. I made coffee the way I always did, measuring the grounds carefully and waiting for the gentle bubbling sound that filled the kitchen with a familiar scent. My routine had always been simple, and simplicity had served me well for most of my life. When Robert and I were younger, we believed that stability came from hard work and careful planning. We saved money quietly, invested slowly, and made decisions that seemed ordinary at the time. I do not think Emily ever paid much attention to those choices when she was growing up, because children rarely notice the quiet sacrifices that surround them every day. She only saw the finished result: school tuition paid on time, a safe house to grow up in, and a future that never felt uncertain. After Robert passed away, the lawyers helped organize the accounts he had carefully built over 40 years. They suggested that I live comfortably and enjoy retirement, but comfort had never been something I needed in large amounts. Instead, I kept the same apartment, drove the same modest car, and continued living in a way that looked very ordinary from the outside. Most people assumed my finances were limited, and I had never felt the need to correct them. Sometimes a quiet life protects you from expectations that do not belong to you. Later that morning, I sat down at my small desk and opened a folder that had not been touched in several months. Inside were documents from the investment accounts Robert left behind, statements that showed years of careful growth and patience. The numbers were far larger than anyone in my family probably imagined. I had never mentioned them because money changes the way people behave, and I preferred the honesty of being underestimated. As I looked through the papers, I thought again about the brunch at the restaurant, about the diamond ring catching the sunlight, while the plastic bracelet sat beside my coffee cup. The difference between those two gifts had not been about money. It had been about attention, about where respect quietly travels when people believe no one is watching. I closed the folder and placed it back into the drawer, feeling neither angry nor sad. What I felt instead was clarity. For many years I had helped Emily whenever she needed support. I helped with her college tuition when scholarships fell short. I contributed to the down payment on the house she and Mark bought after their wedding. I even covered several unexpected expenses when their first child arrived and life felt overwhelming for them. None of those things had ever felt like sacrifices at the time. They felt like the natural extension of being a mother. Yet sitting there in the soft morning light, I realized something important had quietly changed. Support given freely should never become something that people expect without gratitude. That understanding did not bring bitterness. It simply brought direction. I finished my coffee, washed the mug in the sink, and looked once more at the small bracelet resting beside Robert's photograph. Then I placed it gently back inside its box and closed the lid, already beginning to think about the small adjustments that would shape the months ahead. The days following that quiet morning passed slowly, each one settling into the familiar rhythm of my small apartment and the quiet streets outside. I woke early, brewed my coffee the same way I always had, and sat by the window where the soft light of the morning crept across the floorboards. Chicago was beginning to warm with the arrival of late spring, and the snow that once covered the sidewalks had disappeared, replaced by trees slowly filling with green leaves. Life looked ordinary again, at least from the outside. Emily called 2 days later while I was folding laundry in the living room. Her voice sounded cheerful, almost distracted, the way it often did when she was juggling several things at once. She asked how I was doing and mentioned that Linda had already started planning outfits for the cruise. I listened politely, responding with small answers that kept the conversation light. At one point, Emily laughed and said that the ring looked even more beautiful in the sunlight than it had in the restaurant. I told her that sounded lovely. She did not ask about the bracelet. The conversation moved quickly to another topic before ending with the usual promise to visit soon. When the call ended, I set the phone down and returned to folding the laundry without thinking much about it. Yet something inside me had quietly shifted. Over the next week, I continued reviewing the investment documents Robert had left behind. The numbers represented decades of careful planning, small sacrifices, and steady patience. He had always believed that financial independence was not about luxury, but about freedom to make choices without pressure from others. Sitting at my desk, I realized that I had been using that freedom mostly to help people around me. College tuition for Emily. A down payment for the house she and Mark bought. Unexpected expenses when their first child arrived. None of those things had felt like burdens at the time. They felt natural, like extensions of love. Yet now I understood something important that had been quietly forming in my mind since the brunch. Support offered freely should never become something expected without appreciation. The following afternoon, I visited the bank downtown where Robert and I had managed our accounts for many years. The building smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paper, and the same advisor who had helped us in the past greeted me warmly when I arrived. We sat together in a quiet office while he reviewed the documents with professional calm. I explained that I wanted to make a few adjustments to how my accounts were structured and how future financial assistance would be handled. The changes were not dramatic, but they were deliberate. I wanted to ensure that my resources would support causes and plans that truly reflected the life Robert and I had built together. When the meeting ended, I walked outside into the afternoon sunlight, feeling an unfamiliar sense of steadiness. Nothing about my relationship with Emily had changed outwardly. I had not argued with her or expressed disappointment. From her perspective, everything probably seemed exactly the same. But inside my own mind, the direction of my decisions had quietly turned. Sometimes the most powerful changes in a person's life happen without raised voices or dramatic confrontations. They happen quietly, in small offices, in silent moments of understanding, and in the calm realization that respect must travel in both directions if it is going to remain real. After leaving the restaurant that afternoon, I drove home slowly, letting the quiet streets give me time to think. The sunlight over the lake was bright and gentle, the kind that makes the city look calm even when life underneath it is complicated. When I reached my apartment building, I parked in the same spot I had used for years and sat in the car for a moment before stepping out. The hallway inside smelled faintly of laundry detergent and fresh paint because the building manager had recently repainted the doors. It felt comforting in a way that only familiar places can be. Inside my apartment, everything was exactly where I had left it that morning. The small kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall, and the framed photograph of Robert rested near the window where the light always touched the glass first. I placed my purse on the table and removed the small silver box once more. The bracelet inside looked even simpler in the quiet of my living room than it had at the restaurant table. I turned the plastic charm gently between my fingers before setting it back down beside Robert's photograph. He had always been a practical man who believed that actions revealed a person's character more clearly than words ever could. Standing there in the stillness of the room, I could almost hear him repeating something. He used to say when Emily was young, "Respect is not something people announce. It is something they show when no one is asking them to." Later that evening, I prepared a simple dinner of soup and toast and sat by the window watching the sunset stretch long shadows across the parking lot below. Families returned home carrying grocery bags, and children rode bicycles slowly across the sidewalk. Life continued in its usual quiet rhythm. As I watched the sky change color, I began remembering moments from the past that I had not thought about for years. I remembered helping Emily move into her college dorm, writing checks for tuition when scholarships were not enough, and driving across town late at night when she called because something in her apartment had broken. I remembered sitting beside her hospital bed when she delivered her first child and holding her hand while she cried from exhaustion and happiness at the same time. Those memories did not make me feel bitter. They simply reminded me how many years of quiet effort had built the life she was now living. The following morning I woke early as usual and brewed coffee while the city outside slowly came to life. I sat at my small desk and opened the folder containing Robert's investment records. The numbers on the pages represented decades of planning and patience. They also represented choices that still belonged to me. I studied the documents carefully, not with anger, but with clarity. Money had never been the center of my life, but I understood that it carried influence. Influence that could shape how people behaved and what they expected. For many years I had used that influence to help Emily whenever she needed support. Yet sitting there in the quiet morning light, I realized something important had shifted. Generosity is meaningful only when it is respected. Without that respect, it slowly turns into something people assume will always be there. I closed the folder gently and placed it back into the drawer. Nothing dramatic had happened. There had been no arguments or harsh words at the restaurant table. But sometimes a single quiet moment is enough to show a person exactly where they stand, and once that understanding arrives, it changes the direction of every decision that follows. The afternoon after I placed the investment folder back into the drawer, I sat quietly by the window and watched the neighborhood move through its usual routine. A delivery truck stopped across the street, and a young man carried 2 large boxes up the steps of the building opposite mine. A woman walked past with a stroller, speaking softly on her phone, while the child inside laughed at something only children understand. These ordinary scenes had always comforted me because they reminded me that most of life unfolds in simple patterns rather than dramatic moments. Yet something about that quiet afternoon felt slightly different. The clarity that had settled into my thoughts earlier in the week was still there, steady and calm. I thought again about the brunch at the restaurant and the moment Emily slid the small box across the table. The scene had not been loud or angry. No one had raised their voice or created a scene. Instead, it had been something subtler, almost invisible to everyone except the person experiencing it. That is often how truth arrives in families. It does not shout. It simply sits quietly on the table and waits to be noticed. As the sun began to lower behind the buildings, I made another cup of coffee and sat at my small desk where Robert used to review our finances every month. I opened the same drawer that held the investment documents and looked again at the carefully organized folders he had prepared years ago. Robert believed strongly in planning ahead, not because he cared about wealth, but because he valued independence. He used to say that financial stability allowed people to make decisions based on respect rather than obligation. At the time, I had simply nodded and trusted his judgment. Now, years later, I understood exactly what he meant. For most of Emily's adult life, I had quietly stepped in whenever she needed support. When she struggled during her final year of college, I covered the remaining tuition without mentioning the sacrifice it required. When she and Mark wanted to buy their first home, I helped them with the down payment so they could start their life without unnecessary stress. Even after their children were born, I often contributed when unexpected expenses appeared. None of those decisions had felt difficult. They were simply part of loving your child. But sitting there at my desk, I began to recognize something that had slowly developed over time. Support, offered without boundaries, can eventually become something people assume will always exist. They stop seeing the effort behind it. They stop noticing the person providing it. I closed the drawer gently and returned to the living room where the evening light was fading into soft shades of gray. The small bracelet still rested inside its silver box on the table. I looked at it for a moment and then placed the lid back over it carefully. The object itself did not matter very much. What mattered was the quiet understanding it had given me. Sometimes a person does not need confrontation to change the direction of their life. Sometimes all it takes is a single moment that reveals where appreciation truly lives and where it does not. That evening, as the city lights flickered on outside my window, I felt a sense of calm that had nothing to do with anger or disappointment. It came from the simple realization that the choices I made moving forward would be guided by respect, both for myself and for the life Robert and I had built together. I woke early the next morning with the same calm clarity that had been quietly building inside me for days. The apartment was still and peaceful, the soft morning light sliding across the kitchen floor as the coffee maker hummed gently on the counter. I carried my cup to the small table by the window where Robert used to sit every morning before work, reading the newspaper while the city slowly woke up around us. For a long time after he passed away, I continued sitting there because it helped the apartment feel less empty. That morning the street outside looked ordinary. A delivery van stopped briefly across the road while a neighbor walked her dog past the entrance of the building. Life moved forward in small, predictable ways. I took a sip of coffee and thought again about the conversation with Emily earlier in the week. Her request for help had sounded familiar because for years those calls had been part of our routine. Unexpected repairs, tuition payments for the children, or a short-term financial gap that needed covering. Each time I had stepped in quietly because that is what mothers often do. Yet something inside me had shifted after that spring brunch, not in anger, but in understanding. I finished my coffee and opened the desk drawer where Robert's carefully organized documents still rested in neat folders. He had always believed in planning ahead, and his quiet discipline had created a foundation that most people around us never noticed. As I reviewed the papers again, I felt a sense of gratitude for the patience he had shown during those years when saving money meant saying no to certain luxuries. The numbers on those pages represented decades of steady choices that had never been about impressing anyone else. They were simply about building stability. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer with the same care Robert always used. Later that afternoon, I walked down the block to the small cafe where I sometimes spent an hour reading. The place smelled of fresh bread and roasted coffee beans, and the owner greeted me warmly as he always did. I ordered a cup of tea and sat near the window watching people pass along the sidewalk. As I turned the pages of my book, my thoughts returned briefly to Emily. I realized that the quiet boundary I had begun setting was not meant to punish her or create distance. It was simply a way of allowing both of us to see our relationship more clearly. For many years I had made decisions that removed obstacles from her path. Now I understood that real independence sometimes grows only when those obstacles remain. When I returned home, that evening the sunlight was fading into soft shades of gold across the buildings outside my window. I prepared a simple dinner and sat down at the same table where the small silver box still rested beside Robert's photograph. I opened it for a moment and looked at the plastic bracelet again before closing the lid. The object itself still carried no real importance. What mattered was the quiet realization it had sparked. Some moments arrive quietly and change the direction of a person's life without anyone else noticing. They do not require confrontation or dramatic words. They simply reveal the truth of a situation so clearly that the path forward becomes impossible to ignore. As the city lights flickered on one by one outside my window, I felt certain that the choices I had begun making were the right ones, not because they were difficult, but because they were honest. The following weeks moved forward with the same quiet steadiness that had slowly become part of my life. Summer sunlight filled the streets earlier each morning, and the small cafe near my building placed tables outside where neighbors gathered for coffee before work. My routine remained simple and calm. I read in the mornings, walked to the grocery store twice a week, and spent afternoons tending the small plants that Robert once insisted made our balcony look like a tiny garden floating above the city. The small silver box still rested on the table beside his photograph, though by now I rarely thought about the bracelet inside it. Its purpose had already been fulfilled the moment it revealed something I needed to understand. One evening near the end of June, my phone rang while I was preparing dinner. Emily's name appeared on the screen again, and when I answered, her voice sounded slightly more thoughtful than usual. She told me that she and Mark had spent the past few weeks reorganizing their finances after the repair costs from their house. For the first time, she explained how they had created a budget and begun planning ahead so unexpected expenses would not cause stress again. I listened quietly while she described the changes they had made. There was a confidence in her voice that I had not heard before. It was the sound of someone discovering that independence can feel satisfying rather than frightening. When she finished speaking, she paused for a moment and then said something that surprised me. She thanked me for always helping when she was younger and admitted that she had never fully understood how much patience and planning had gone into those years of support. Her words were simple and sincere. I told her that raising a child has never been about keeping score, but about preparing them to build their own life one day. That evening after the call ended, I carried my dinner to the window and watched the warm glow of sunset spread across the buildings outside. The city looked peaceful in the fading light. Cars moved slowly through the intersections while people walked along the sidewalks, enjoying the cooler evening air. I thought about how relationships evolve over time, sometimes through long conversations, and sometimes through quiet changes that no one fully notices at first. In our case, the shift had happened gently. There had been no arguments or harsh words, only a calm moment of realization that allowed both of us to see things differently. A few days later, Emily invited me to visit their house for a Sunday afternoon barbecue. When I arrived, the children ran across the yard laughing, and Emily greeted me with a warm hug before handing me a glass of iced tea. The atmosphere felt relaxed and genuine, free from the unspoken expectations that had quietly existed before. At one point during the afternoon, Emily sat beside me on the patio and told me she had been thinking about how families sometimes take each other for granted without realizing it. She said she was grateful for the way I had supported her throughout her life, and that she hoped to show the same kind of patience to her own children one day. I smiled and told her that learning those lessons is simply part of growing older. As the sun lowered behind the trees and the laughter of the children drifted across the yard, I realized that the quiet boundary I had set earlier that spring had not created distance between us. Instead, it had helped restore the balance that allows respect to grow naturally between two people who love each other. The rest of the summer moved forward in a quiet and thoughtful way, and the small changes that had begun months earlier slowly revealed their effect. Emily and Mark continued managing their household on their own, and although I did not ask many questions, I could hear the difference in Emily's voice each time we spoke on the phone. She sounded more careful, more deliberate, as if she had begun paying attention to details that once felt unimportant. One evening near the end of July, she called while I was watering the plants on my balcony. The sky above the city was turning a deep shade of orange as the sun settled behind the buildings, and the warm air carried the soft hum of traffic from the street below. Emily told me they had finally finished paying off the repair expenses from the house, and had even managed to set aside a small emergency fund for the first time. There was pride in her voice when she said it, the quiet satisfaction that comes when someone realizes they are capable of solving their own problems. I congratulated her sincerely and told her that learning to build stability step by step was one of the most valuable skills a person could develop. After a moment, she grew quiet and then admitted something that surprised me. She said that over the past few months, she had started thinking more carefully about the way people in a family show appreciation to one another. She explained that when life moves quickly, it becomes easy to assume that certain people will always be there in the background, supporting everything without needing recognition. Her voice softened slightly as she said that she had begun to understand how much patience and consistency that kind of support requires. I listened calmly without interrupting because I knew that realizations like that cannot be rushed or forced. They arrive only when a person is ready to see them. A few weeks later, Emily invited me to join the family for another dinner at their house. When I arrived, the late summer evening felt warm and peaceful, and the children were playing in the yard while Mark stood near the grill preparing food. Emily greeted me with a long hug and handed me a glass of iced tea before we sat together on the patio. The atmosphere was relaxed and comfortable, filled with the kind of quiet laughter that grows naturally between people who feel at ease with one another. During dinner, Emily spoke openly about the changes she and Mark had made in their finances and how those changes had helped them feel more confident about the future. At one point, she looked at me with a thoughtful expression and said she hoped that as her own children grew older, she would remember to show appreciation more clearly than she sometimes had in the past. I simply smiled and told her that life has a way of teaching all of us important lessons when we are willing to listen. As the evening settled into twilight and the children chased fireflies across the grass, I realized that the quiet boundary I had placed earlier that spring had allowed something valuable to grow. It had given Emily the space to develop her own strength, while reminding both of us that respect within a family must flow in both directions. When I returned home that night and stepped into the familiar stillness of my apartment, I noticed the small silver box still resting beside Robert's photograph. I looked at it for a moment before turning off the lights and heading toward bed, knowing that the simple object inside had already played its role in guiding our story toward a better understanding. By the time autumn arrived, the air carried the crisp scent of falling leaves, and the city seemed to move at a slightly calmer pace than it had during the summer months. The trees along my street turned shades of gold and deep orange, and every morning sunlight filtered through the branches and painted soft patterns across the floor of my apartment. Life had returned to its quiet rhythm, yet the understanding that had grown over the past months continued to shape the way I saw things. Emily and I still spoke regularly, and our conversations now carried a different tone than before. There was more thought in her voice, more awareness in the way she described her decisions. One afternoon, she called to tell me that she and Mark had begun setting aside money for their children's future education. She explained how they had created a long-term plan and how satisfying it felt to watch their savings slowly grow. I could hear the pride in her voice, and it reminded me of the quiet satisfaction Robert used to feel whenever one of our careful plans began to take shape. Later that month, Emily invited me to join the family for dinner again, this time to celebrate Mark's promotion at work. When I arrived at their house, the evening was cool and peaceful, and the scent of autumn leaves drifted through the open windows. The children greeted me with excited hugs before running back outside to play. Emily welcomed me warmly and guided me to the kitchen where she had been preparing dinner. While we arranged dishes on the table, she spoke thoughtfully about how much she had learned during the past year. She admitted that for a long time she had assumed certain things in life would always be there to support her without realizing how much effort had gone into building those foundations. I listened quietly, allowing her words to unfold without interruption. At one point she paused and said that she hoped she could teach her own children to appreciate the people who quietly helped shape their lives. I smiled gently and told her that every generation eventually learns its own lessons about gratitude and responsibility. The dinner that evening felt relaxed and genuine, filled with laughter and simple conversation. As we sat together on the patio afterward, watching the children chase one another across the yard beneath the fading evening light, I realized that the small moment months earlier had not divided our family. Instead, it had created space for understanding to grow naturally. When I returned home later that night, I stepped into the familiar stillness of my apartment and noticed the silver box still resting beside Robert's photograph. For a moment I opened it and looked at the bracelet one last time before closing the lid again. The object had long since lost its importance, yet it remained a quiet reminder of the clarity that had arrived that spring morning. Sometimes the most meaningful changes in life begin with a moment that seems almost too small to notice. Over time, that moment grows into understanding, and understanding slowly reshapes the way people treat one another. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I felt grateful not only for the life Robert and I had built together, but also for the calm strength that comes from knowing when to step forward and when to step back. In the end, respect had returned to our relationship in the most natural way possible, not through confrontation or dramatic words, but through patience, honesty, and the quiet realization that love within a family is strongest when it is balanced with appreciation.